And if you're thinking to yourself, I didn't know we had a Consul General of Ireland. Well, yes, we do. There's more than just you, Claire. But Claire is our Consul General. We are in her domain, I guess you would call it. She is, the Consul General is based in Austin, Texas. And she was appointed in 2019, so she's kind of recent to this. And previously, she served in the embassies of Ireland in Uganda and Zambia. And Claire, the next time we have you back to speak to the Irish, we want you to talk about what was that like, being in Africa. Oh my goodness. Okay, so I'm going to let Claire come on now, and she's going to tell you about the mission of the Consul General of Ireland. Go ahead, Claire.
Gurf Mahagut, Ellen, agus Gamanadi Eve Galer, Accordia, Ismisha, Clorny Corrig, Orth Consul Naheran, on show in Austin, Texas. So, yes, good evening, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good middle of the night to you, wherever you are. I'm Claire McCarthy, the Irish Consul General. And Ellen is quite right. I think there are 7 of us now. We're multiplying, yes. And so I represent Ireland, the government of Ireland, in the gorgeous state of New Mexico, which is one of the great pleasures of my job. And thanks so much to Ellen, Kathy and Bill for inviting me along this evening. It's great to be with you. But I am not going to lie, I'm a bit nervous. I actually feel a bit exposed being here this evening because, you know, you'll all know this already, but people in my line of work, we are not shy about quoting or stealing the words of poets quite often and putting them into speeches here, there and everywhere when we are trying to make a point or win over an audience. And that's all very well and good on a normal day, but when you can actually see the whites of these poets' eyes now here looking back at me on the screen, it's a different matter. I probably owe them royalties at this stage. I can see Adrian making a little list going, yeah, you do. So look, I mean, you don't need me this evening to kind of explain or justify this kind of enduring and I suppose evolving canon of poetry that's coming off the island of Ireland and poets who are from the island of Ireland. So it's certainly never been a better time really to be an Irish poet in the United States. And that's not just about the love of poetry from the man in the White House and his imprimatur, if you like, but also I suppose, I think what we've seen over the last year is this kind of interest in poetry fueled partly by the pandemic, I suppose, and our need for answers and our need for questions too sometimes, and realizing that poetry can provide those answers or indeed those questions when we're facing, you know, the difficulties like we have all faced individually and together over the past year. So we are extremely grateful to you, Levi, Adrian, Paul, and Attracta, for the work that you do, not just in terms of making my speeches sound a whole lot better, but also for when you provide those moments of solace and balm that we all need, particularly at these particular times. Now, I'll also be sacked, Ellen, if I don't remind everyone that my boss, the Irish ambassador, starts every single day with poetry on Twitter. And I'm sure some of the people on this call already know that. But feel free to check in his Twitter account if you want to start your day with some Irish poetry. And for the month of February, I'm pleased that he's featuring Irish women poets, and I believe one Attracta Fahy is on the list for next week. So we're looking forward to that. So I think that's enough from me. Thanks so much again for the invitation, Ellen, Bill and Kathy. I'm very grateful, and I'm looking forward to the evening with the special guests. Enjoy the evening, everyone. Go to Mila Margaret.
Thank you so much, Claire. We're so glad to have you with us. And we'll be talking to you again later in the year, I think, perhaps. Yes, we'll get back with you again. Thank you so much. Okay, I'd like to then now introduce our second honored guest. And this is Levi Romero. Levi Romero is the New Mexico Poet Laureate. He is actually the inaugural Poet Laureate, first established last year. So if you can say anything, what good things came out of 2020? One of them is that we have a New Mexico Poet Laureate, which is kind of amazing. Levi has 2 books of poetry. One is called A Poetry of Remembrance, New and I love this, New and Rejected Works. That's good. And another book called In the Gathering of Silence. And currently, Levi is an assistant professor in Chicana and Chicano Studies department at the University of New Mexico. So please welcome Levi Romero. Levi, where are you? There you go.
I'm right here. Thank you. Thank you so much. Saludos. Buenas tardes to everybody out there. I'm here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, enjoying a wonderful 52 degrees. It's about 7:17 in the evening. So as I was reading some of the chats, some of you are in very cold and dark places right now. But together we're going to warm things up with poetry, as we always do. On behalf of the New Mexico Poet Laureate Program and the numerous poetry communities throughout New Mexico, I want to welcome everyone to this evening's Irish Poet Salon, featuring 3 distinguished Irish poets, Adrian Rice, Attracta Fahy, and Paul Muldoon, en amistad y poesía. Bienvenidos.
Thank you, Levi. So glad to have you. Thank you for being with us. Okay, so now I'm going to turn the rest of the evening over to Bill Nevins, who is our programs director and is kind of single-handedly responsible for putting together tonight's program. So thank you, Bill, for doing this. And I will let Bill take it over from here and introduce the poet.
Well, thank you, Ellen. And thank you, Kathy. I think I'm up. Here we are. Yes.
You're good. Yeah, you're good.
Good. Thank you very much. Yeah, and it's not single-handed. It's a whole. It takes a crowd to make a village, and took all of us here to make this happen. So thanks. Among the folks that helped out, of course, this program sponsored by the Irish American Society of New Mexico. We also have very kind donations sponsoring from Jules Poetry Playhouse of Placitas, New Mexico, from the New Mexico State Poetry Society, from the Fixed and Free Poetry, from the University of New Mexico Irish Studies Program, and terrific encouragement from the Irish American Writers and Artists, and from y'all. So we have 3 wonderful poets from various parts of Ireland who live in various parts of the world right now. 2 of our poets live in the United States, and one of our poets is in County Galway in Ireland, and it's 2 a.m. there right now. The books that each of these poets put out, and some put out CDs and albums too, they can all be gotten either from your local bookstores, including Bookworks here in Albuquerque, and of course online, and from the poets directly themselves. Poets we have tonight are, of course, the Pulitzer Prize winning poet Paul Muldoon, Adrian Rice, another poet from the north of Ireland, and Attracta Fahy. Going to introduce Attracta Fahy right now. Attracta Fahy has a background in farming, in nursing, and social care. She works in private practice as an integrative and humanistic psychotherapist and survivor and supervisor. She lives in the rural County Galway in the beautiful west of Ireland with her children. She won the 2019 Irish Times New Irish Writing Award. Her new book is this one, Dinner in the Fields. Highly recommend it. About that book, published last year, the critic Maureen Newlin describes Attracta's work as true poetry of the soul, which gives us a sense of our connectedness to the universe, to nature, and to each other. Irish American Society, we are honored to have all 3 poets, and we're Very specially happy to hear Attracta poetry, Attracta Fahy, no, Attracta poetry Fahy. Yes, okay, Attracta.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And thank you to the New Mexico Irish American Society for inviting me from you. And it's such a privilege to be here. And I want to thank Ellen for all her work and emails. Kathy, Claire, Levi, and I hope I haven't missed anybody there in that. So it's a wonderful privilege to be reading with two very prestigious poets. I'm feeling quite nervous, a bit like imposter syndrome. And their poetry I love, so that makes it easier. I also want to give a shout out to all my friends that have checked in from Ireland, and my friends from Billy Collins Poetry Broadcast, to Billy and Susanna, and all the friends from the group are cool people, nice people, and my friends from Cultivating Voices, and any family. I haven't seen their names coming up, but I haven't looked. So I'm going to read a few poems first from my book, Dinner in the Fields, published by Flying the Wall Poetry Press. And just to say a little bit about my book before I start, it's a chapbook, and it's my first publishing. And it's based on, I suppose, landscape and place and where I grew up. I grew up in Northeast Galway, and I managed to progress over to East Galway. I haven't moved out of Galway. So I think that I found when I started to write poetry 4 years ago, I'd always written, but I decided to do a course to learn the craft. I found everything I was writing was relating to place and where I came from. And as a psychotherapist, I know how important the formative years are. And really that was reflecting in the poetry, the formative years, you know, and that sense of place. So I grew up, I always say to people, I was born in a graveyard. I grew up at the top of a hill, and there were two graveyards, one each side, and no houses for a mile on one side and down the hill. So there was one a 17th century graveyard. So I was surrounded by archaeological sites, and I think that had a huge influence, and that's reflected here. So just to give you that insight. So I'll start with my first poem, which is called Etchings. And it's, I suppose that's from my childhood, and you'll pick up, it's me playing in the graveyard as a child. Etchings. There will be no miracles in the graveyard amongst the dead. Little happens in the quiet presence of departed souls. Our 17th century graveyard cradled our house, became my home. Tall slabs like brothers guarded tombs. Tiny wildflowers, buttercups in old grass, a welcome colour to the dead. At least spirits listened. Tension cannot hear. It cannot bear even its own silence. Spirits heard, without ever a word. Fumbled walls of stone reveal their bones, holding slabs with words in ancient tongue. The intricate letters, hidden names, once carved with grace, now corroded beneath its lichen. Slipping little fingers through each line, clearing moss, powdered lime. A child traced slowly into life, etchings. And the next poem I'll read again is from the graveyard, and I suppose that 17th century graveyard, my family would be buried there several generations, and I would have thought as a child all my ancestors are buried there, and I thought they lived underground. I had wild fantasies in that graveyard, and you know, there's lots of old tombs, and it was a great place to, you know, I grew up in the 60s, so there was no television, no phone, so you had your tea set and you could go down to the tombs and have a table and a shop and everything. They were very handy. You could play hide and seek. So that's where I thought my ancestors are buried, and I realized later in life that I have probably more ancestors buried in America. I have 8 grandaunts buried in Boston in one graveyard. So it's, but anyway, this is called Our Sleeping Women, and I'm speaking here to my grandmothers. Our sleeping women. I think of my grandmothers, their faces etched in mine. Their strength sleeps in my bones. We meet in fields of crows. Their voices speak through wind. Old graves slope down from our farm. As a child, I played house, tea sets on tombs, innocent, listening to spirits. Daughters left to work with duty, not to themselves, but to others who cared little for the objects they'd become. From the clay they cry the song of the crone, dreams of the life unlived. Hope moves in the soil beneath my feet, rises in my breath. They call, willing me on with their work. Don't listen to scavengers who have taken your use, their fear ripping your pleasure. Scream yourself into your body. Starve if you need until you're heard. Your face ours, your womb creator, the only real home, yourself. And the next poem I'm going to read is called Dinner in the Fields, and it's the title for the book. And it's about, you know, when we worked in the fields, because everybody, it was all hands on deck. So I loved my mother brought the dinners out into the fields to us. Dinner in the Fields. I remember you arriving to the fields when we saved the hay, bringing the sweet taste of dinners encased in Tupperware. Sitting sheltered under haycocks in the warm sun. We rested our young bodies from sweating our work, tasted the bright tang of cut grass, drinking sugared tea from my waddy bottles, our dinner in the fields. After, we waited again for you to come in the evening. Buttermilk our snack between your arrivals. Longing for tea, we quenched our dusty mouths. Finally, the sunset took us home before another long day, bodies stretched in the light, making hay. And I'm going to read another poem. It's called I Didn't Know My Father's Father. I didn't know my grandfather. And this was inspired by I was thinking of a plough that was just leaning on a wall all our lives. It's still there. And I knew Seamus Heaney had written a poem about ploughing. So I thought it might have been 20 years since I read it. So I thought, I'm not going to read it. I'm going to write my own and then see. There was the second part of my kind of exercise, which was I wanted to capture the same feeling of bringing people into what ploughing was like and see what the similarities would be. So I found it a very interesting poem to write because I went to his poem then afterwards. And there are similarities, but there's differences. And of course, the syntax in his is exceptional. You know, mine is a very different story. And it's called, I Didn't Know My Father's Father. I didn't know my father's father, but I knew his plough. Its remains leaned into the side wall of our barn, years groaning in on itself. I imagine it's still there, a dull brown monument resting on grass. My granduncle used a horse plough. He sat on its high seat like a king disposed as he cultivated fields, later parked in an outhouse. My father's hand plough was kept in the shed. I watched him oil and grease it and preserved all year in preparation for spring. The plough's sharp sting of metallic glint in the sun, the knife-edged double blades, curled, shaped in feminine curves, like a proud, strong woman. Watched him steer, hands clasped on bars, making a fist on the handles. His teeth clenched as if biting stone. Meticulous eye in exactitude looking ahead, he cut line after line into the earth, slicing soil row after row. The taste of supple mud in his mouth, each slice falling smoothly left, creating a furrow. I could smell the clay in the air as he put strength, focused his well on breaking the clogs, lumps, bumps, us with our spades clearing stones. I watched him battling in wobbles, sweat streaming his face, the power of a man working his plough, the wisdom of fathers before him. This was the way of our life, like worms growing new heads for each season. My father knew ground must be prepared. Every beginning is joined to the end. What gives duration? The ways cycles, how to cultivate and reap. Over our heads a hood of crows, picking chopped worms, relieved to see they reinvent. And the next one I'm going to read is called Owning of the Birds. And my favorite writer as a child, like I said, we had no television, we had no phone, and we hadn't an awful lot of books. We had Beatrix Potter, but there was one book there that was belonged to my father from the 1930s, and it was Porrick Pierce book. I have it here. Plays, stories, and poems. I keep forgetting which order. And we had a parlor. Everybody had a parlor. If you had any kudos at all, you had a parlor, and you only used it really for special occasions, the stations and christening. But that's where the books were. And I loved to go, because there was 7 children. I loved to go into the parlor and read. And also, when I felt a need for connection, if I wasn't getting the connection outside in nature, which is where I got it, I go to this story, Owning of the Birds, and it's about a young boy. It's the most beautiful story I've ever read in my life. And I had the same reaction every time I read it for years. I would cry and cry and cry for Owning. I loved Owning. And for some reason this year, my mother was 30 years dead. And Owning loved the swallows, and he used to wait for them to come, and eventually he went off with the swallows. So my mother was 30 years dead this year, and I was thinking of Owning. And I wrote this poem only in August, so it's not in the book. It's called Owning of the Birds. Every year they arrive, their long journey across sky and land. I think of my childhood, when I hid in the parlor away from the others. How often I read the story, Owning of the Birds. In grief when he left, his mother's grief, an outpouring every time. 30 years since they took you to a late August morning, over the skies, a warmer land and the sun. This morning I open my door, slight breeze through trees, rustling leaves, a cuckoo in the distance, ready to leave too, its young feeding from a robin's bill. I imagine you somewhere in the nearby woods, absorbed in silence, singing to yourself, adios amigos. And every year when the swallows leave, I see you and Owning wave goodbye. So I have another small one. I'm going to finish on one about the tune Mother and Baby Home, but there's one I also wrote, it's not in the book, and it was inspired just, and it's because I'm reading in America, I thought I'd like to read this. It was the Portland riots that struck me, the protests and the riots. I read a story about a woman who walked out into the intersection. I don't know if anybody knows about it, but people were talking about it, and I had read other stories, other myths, and about women. This was kind of the grain goddesses in Egyptian mythology. That's what she did. They would walk kind of naked and flash and whatever. So people were disturbed by this woman, but yet she had a profound effect, because I read the whole story where the police, everything stopped, the police, the army, and they looked at her. And the story seemed to pass after a day or two. Nobody seemed to take any notice. So I wrote this poem about it, and it's sort of tying in with the grain goddess. Then we have the Sheila na Gig. So Sheila na Gig in Ireland is the pagan goddess as well. And I'm sure you'll be familiar with it. So I call this the vagina goddess. 1:45 a.m. nightly protests in Portland. Sheila na Gig walks out onto the intersection, paces the crosswalk in front of armed police, officers in riot gear. They stare, eyes fixated on her poise. Headlights glare as she moves in ballerina poses, naked other than face mask and cap. Hecate lies down, kicks up her feet, refuses protection from others nearby, her body defying their thoughts. Yes, I'm vulnerable. That is my strength. She opens her legs, a flash to all who dare look. Vagina goddess of Eleusinian mysteries. Ba rises from the burial place of shame, takes the stone head of patriarchy. Come, come, her eyes say to men who believe you just grab her by the pussy. Come, her body invites. It's dream time again. Divine feminine, collective power. She tilts her head to her shoulder. They move away. Grain goddess knows how to relieve tension. Babu knows there's life even in tragedy. Thank you. And I'm going to finish on a poem that I wrote because I come from Tuam, and everybody I'm sure will have heard about the Tuam mother and babies, or the mother and baby homes here, and all the scandal. And for anyone that doesn't know, the Tuam mother and babies, there was 796 babies found in an unused septic tank. And I would have been born in the Bon Secours in Tuam. The Bon Secours sisters ran the St. Mary's home for mother and babies. And all of that stopped in the year I was born. The Magdalene laundries continued, but the mother and baby home and all of this sort of women being put in there, young girls and babies being adopted out without the mother's permission. So all that stopped the summer I was born. And later I went back and I trained as a nurse and I worked there, but we really didn't know, we knew there was a Magdalene laundry, that's it. So I start this poem at the beginning as an epigram from Seamus Heaney, from his book Anid, The Tuam Mother and Baby Home. At once a sound of crying fills the air, the high wails and the weeping of infant souls, little ones denied their share of sweet life, torn from the breast on life's very doorstep. A dark day bore them off and sank them in untimely death. Seamus Heaney. We called it the Grove, where nature offered refuge. I look at the photograph once cherished. Such innocence. This nun tended me for 10 days when my mother was ill. Does her smile appear hard, conceal doom? The vow of silence has left us mute. All questions. Did she coerce, tyrannize, or was her love overwhelmed by the poverty and overcrowding? So many daughters dumped in fear. What I want to know is whether these hands that once held me have blood on them. I see a gemp of starched linen beneath coif, cornet, and veil, that rigid bib. I think of the vows, the blessings of the Bon Secours. After school, I nursed in that wing, where I and these babies were born. Girls, there's a shadow in this place, I'd say. We have to let the light in. Each time the walls enclosed us, the eerie feeling haunts. I imagine dark rooms, darker silence. Within this lover of history, Catherine Corliss uncovers rumoured babies. She persists, reveals tiny bones, skeletal bundles, and scattered remains. Young children, babies in a septic tank. Looking back, I shared a nursery with these babies. Their shamed mothers segregated from the likes of me. What if, and if, my infant imaginary friends, in babbling conversations, ghosting themselves into my life, were thrown into septic reservoirs and sewers? I look again at the picture. Neither trust nor love is possible. The arms that held children in God's name are soiled. Once more I glance again, this time behind the nun's habit, to a dark door, obscure shadows on the walls. The baby she holds seems to look away, gazing out to the world, her eyes facing the light. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you.
Attracta, thank you so much. Brilliant is not enough to say.
Thank you.
Smooth. And everyone is muted, but I can hear the roar of their applause right now. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate being here. Thank you.
Dr. Fahy, everyone, and her wonderful, wonderful book is right here is Dinner in the Fields.
Yeah.
Wonderful. I guess we'll have our next poet here, Adrian Rice. Adrian Rice is from Belfast in the north of Ireland. He grew up in a working class community known as the Loyalist, sometimes called the Protestant community, although there are people of different religions there and no religion. But he grew up in that community. He then graduated from the University of Ulster. He has taught and lectured throughout the United Kingdom, Ireland, and America, and also on radio and TV. He lives in North Carolina, where he teaches at Appalachian State University and often teams up with a fellow Belfast man and traditional musician and songwriter, Alan Mearns, who is here right now. They have a group called the Belfast Boys, who I hope will come and play for us one day. His latest book is The Strange Estate, New and Selected Poems, 1968 to 2017. Here it is. Yeah. And he is also featured in the current anthology, Open-Eyed, Whole-Throated, anthology of American Irish poets. I'd like to give you Adrian Rice.
Thank you so much, Bill. And funny enough, the first poem I'm going to read is actually from that anthology. How did you know? We have Natalie Anderson with us, who's the editor of the book, who's a great friend. So, you know, what a lovely little start. Thank you, Bill. Thank you to, you know, all the wonderful work, you know, Ellen, and I see Claire. Thank you, Claire, for your lovely words too. And Levi, fantastic to meet you. Delighted there's a poet laureate in New Mexico. I'm delighted it's you, my man. And I'm always honored to be in the shadow of the great P. Muldoon. Paul Muldoon's one of my heroes. And he'll hate me for saying that, but he is. Attracta, just lovely to be reading with you. You know, it's great to be on this little team tonight. Awesome. So I'm going to get stuck in. My wife always says, try not to talk too much. I want to start with a poem called While I Slept from the book that Bill referenced. Because I woke up this morning with a dream. I dreamt the most amazing dream about the friend that I actually dedicated The Strange Estate to. He was my best friend back home. We grew up together in Rathcoole, next door to each other from the age of 6. And so we were, you know, the best of friends. And sadly, he died freakishly young just a couple of years ago, just out of the blue. And in the dream this morning, I was with him and we ended up in Whitehead Golf Course, which he loves. And he put his bag down at the end of the game and he propped it up. And I said, what's wrong? And he went into a pocket and he took out one of my books for me to sign in my dream. And I was embarrassed and I laughed. And I said, for goodness sake, you know, I said something like that, maybe a bit cruder, you know, wise up, put the book away. And he said, no, I want you to sign it. And I opened it embarrassedly and the page was blank. It isn't blank at the start of my book, but it was. And I really said to myself in my dream, should I tell him that he's dead? Like maybe I need to just stop the stream and tell him that he's actually dead. And my heart started to break. And I thought, no, I can't, I wouldn't be right. You know, I got to think of something to write in it. And I woke up and so make of that whatever you will. But this is a dream I had a few years ago. And it was about the house I was born in, Rosebrook 30 Doak Road, the bottom of the Doak Road where it meets the Shore Road, and my grandparents' house. And it doesn't exist anymore. And some people from that era are still alive. A lot of them are dead, obviously. And anyway, this is a poem called While I Slept. I was the wick, unlit at first, as all around me my birth house reassembled itself from the ground up, like wax unmelting. 10 or so, the memorable age. Each room reappeared, each stick of furniture, showing me what had been forgotten. Each family member was there, those now gone, those still here, and I moved among them, solid but unseen. I was the wick, unlit at first, but when everything was fully formed, memory peaked, and I became flame. The house and they began to melt away, all that memory had rebuilt while I slept. Now, the first poems I wrote, I got totally converted to poetry at the age of 14 by a remarkable English teacher called Samuel Thompson at Ballyclare High School. At that stage, I had the hair shaved and I was a little Rathcool, tearaway. But he just captured me by reading John Keats's Ode to a Nightingale out loud on the first day in class. And I didn't know what it was. I didn't know that it was poetry, but I knew that whatever it was, I needed to get more of it. But I was so respectful of the poets that we grew up with in Ireland. We don't just have Paul, we have people that Paul would look up to, like Seamus and John Montague and the Kennellys of this world and Derek Mahans and all sorts of people. And so I felt back home I didn't need to write. We really didn't need any other poets. But in the middle of my 20s, I was kind of talked into writing a poem. And then I started at 29, 30 with an artist friend, Ross Wilson, who just forced me to write. And we did the Muck Island box together. And that kind of just opened the trapdoor that I fell through. And all of a sudden, whatever a poet is, I think you're only a poet when you're writing poems, but whatever a poet is, I apparently became something like that. And I'm always amazed that the first poems I wrote for the Muck Island box were pure imagination. It was nothing to do really about my own life. It wasn't, it was just, I made them up. So here's a couple of quick ones that I made up. One's called The Mason's Tongue. Although a likable, charitable soul, he had a less than secret tongue. So it was removed and entombed, a ritual distance from the shore, sealed dumb in the packed sand. When the young man dug it up, out toiling for some bait, it dropped from the wet spade onto the cool slab of strand and lay like a gnawed curl of meat. The young man cupped it in his hands to get a closer look when, staring on his palms and with a strangely mournful note, it suddenly began to speak. Go tell all the brethren, there is no rest where I have gone. No answer comes from Yabulon. Bewildered and seized with sudden dread, he let the tongue flop to the sand, then scooped it back up with his spade and flung it out across the waves. Yet, though hushed upon the ocean bed, the tongue's words lapped about his head. Go tell all the brethren, there is no rest where I have gone. No answer comes from Yabulon. And here's another one from that early set. I lived in Isla McGee. I'd moved from the Hood out onto the Isla McGee Peninsula with my young family, and lots of people, through stories of the elderly people that I got to be friends with, down to the graveyard visits that I would pay on Isla McGee, the little rural graveyards. So many people had lost their lives by drowning. And I thought, you know what, I got to write a poem about a drowning, even though I know nothing about it, thankfully. And I kind of wanted to redeem, in a way, the whole horrible experience of losing somebody to drowning. So, and I wanted to get a little image of the snowstorms that every granny and granda has in their china cabinet in at the end of some poem or another. So it worked its way into this one. This is called The Drowning. Seeking luck through the evening, he spat into the torn mouth of the first fish pulled on board. Fish's eyes have seen strange things, he murmured, the uneasy burden of a prophetic word. With darkness came a listening wind. The sea made mouths at us all night. Not until the break of light did he come in, off Heddle's port, pockets inside out, mouth full of the ocean's spit. Suppose what they say is true. We sink beneath the sea, lost in the flood of memory. Then say his last journey was no macabre pirouette through the watery dark, but that he went down serenely, wrapped as in a childhood zone, in the whirling silence of a snowstorm under an oval dome. And then, folks, I'm jumping ahead. You come here to America. I came to the Norrang College as a visiting writer. I won an award thing in '99. I was here for 5 weeks, and I got kidnapped by my beautiful wife Molly. I met her after 4 days here, and she followed me home the following year, and we spent 5 years in Ireland. And then LR asked me to come back to Hickory as a writer in residence for 6 months. And then, to cut a long story short, we were literally kidnapped at the end of that, and I haven't been allowed to go home. That's like 16 years ago, and we're happily kidnapped. But here I discovered that you had porches. My goodness, the Americans have porches. This is like a secret poetry machine, a porch. You know, we don't have them in Ireland, or else they're covered in because of the weather. And here I could sit on the porch in Hickory and just watch everything. And I started to strangely receive poems. And here's just 2 quick ones from that. This is one actually dedicated to Ross Wilson, my artist friend from home. And he doesn't really enjoy the dedication because there's kind of something serious going on behind this poem. But I was sitting on the porch one night and a storm started to brew, and literally the blackest leaf you could ever imagine just blew in. Solitary leaf just came into the porch and just landed on my open notebook. Like jet black leaf. I've never seen a leaf that black. And I just closed my notebook and the thunder started and I went into the house. But I got this poem really strangely that night. So I called it A Dark Leaf. It's just a little, for want of a better word, a little sonnet thing. Along the alley of our avenue, birds flicker nervously between tall trees, nests bobbing under the black and blue of a stormful sky. The high branch kelp sways in the lifting wind wave, delivering a dark leaf through the mailbox of my porch, dropping onto my notebook like a sign. Everything is darkening. Lightning flirts with telegraph poles. Thunderballs rumble the bowling lanes overhead, their mumbles silencing the cooing of a dove. Here comes the rain, so redolent of home. Odd, the things we miss of the things we love. Time to pack up and go inside alone. And then I got a poem on the porch one night that really surprised me. My wife and I she'd picked me up at the community college when I worked there late one night, and we didn't have our little 10-year-old. He wasn't born. And we went across the road late at night to get bread and milk from Walmart, of all places. And Walmart has taught me, never underestimate the temple that is Walmart. I've got some amazing poems from just being there, you know, and being very humbled in there. And we were in it one night and we were at the checkout and we noticed this, what I can only describe as a working class couple in front of us with their children. And the kids were crying for these helium balloons, expensive balloons for a party. And I just knew that they couldn't afford them. We couldn't afford them. And so I just brought the Irish accent in and I said, listen, you don't want to buy those. You want to buy the wee packets of balloons, like 100 of them that your dad will have to blow up. And it's going to like nearly kill him. He's going to be blowing these balloons up and speaking in a squeaky voice. And the kids started laughing and they went for it. So as the parents walked off, the guy turned to me and kind of just waved and mouthed a thank you, you know, and I waved at him. And I said to Molly, there's a poem in that. I've just no idea what it is, but there's a poem there. And it was years later, sitting on the porch again. I went out, I sat down one night and I just wrote the word breath at the top of the notebook. And the opening verse just came out. What is death but a letting go of breath? And I thought, that's nah. And I thought, no, it's demanding to be written. And so it just flowed really quickly that night. Very strange poem. And Because the Guardian picked up on it, it's taken on a life of its own, this poem. So it's called Breath. What is death but a letting go of breath? One of the last things he did was to blow up the children's balloons for the birthday party, joking and mock cursing as he struggled to tie all those footery teeth. Then he flicked them into the air for the children to fight over. Some of them survived the party and were still there after the funeral in every room of the house, bobbing around mockingly in the least draught. She thought about murdering them with her sharpest knife, each loud pop an angry bullet from her heart. Instead, in the quietness that followed her children's sleep, she patiently gathered them all up, slowly undoing each raggedy nipple, and one by one she took his last breaths into her mouth. What is life but a drawing in of breath? And then Attracta was brought up the graveyard. Thank you, Attracta. You brought up. We're in sync here tonight. And in these COVID times, one of the only walk that my wife and I and my little boy do when we can talk him into it is from the house down through the little neighborhood here and round the beautiful graveyard and back. You know, and so I've become very fond of the graveyard. And so I guess this is some kind of a COVID poem. I'm not quite sure if that's what it is, but I'm hoping that if I can get the rest of a new book together, that it'll actually make the title of a new book. And I think the times we're living in, the title, The Chances of Harm, is probably appropriate in so many ways. And it certainly takes me back to Ireland too, you know, growing up throughout the Troubles and all the rest of it. The Chances of Harm is just sticking with me as a title. It's actually just out in the New Asheville Poetry Review, which is an amazing journal. I got to plug the Asheville Poetry Review. Keith Flynn and the boys and the women up there do great work with that. But this is called The Chances of Harm. I was in the graveyard and I just saw this. I knew everything went really, really quiet. And I just instinctively looked up and a huge hawk had just cruised in. And on the way out of the graveyard, in the middle of this amazing bush, like a tree bush, there was a huge owl. And the two things just came together for me. So here's The Chances of Harm. It arrives like God, living, killing machine, silent hearse of the air, rolling in on no wheels, makes perfect weight between wide wings. Uttermost branch of the tallest tree, all judge and jury, Lord of no doubt. I am species safe, so too the buried bones of these fields of death, whose headstones are tills awaiting the cha-ching of the last trump. A big daylight owl seems unimpressed, blinking the chances of harm. A cardinal goes off like a car alarm. And then the last poem I'll read is to take you back to Ireland a bit. It's an old cliche, I'm sure. I'm sure Paul Attracta anybody that's been here, lived here any length of time. The old cliche is that you have to go away from your country to write about it. And I always thought that was just a terrible cliche, but in my case, it's kind of strangely true. And I've been writing poems for a few years now that I've published here and there in a couple of the books, but it's building up into a big sequence that I hope to call 11th Night. And that's a term from the Protestant hood back home, you know, around the 12th of July, the 11th night, the bonfires, all of that. And I guess it's my little take, it's my little nod to 12th night, you know, but in the end, but it's 11th night. And the poems started and they're all coming out in these strange 11 syllable long rhyming couplets, which is just not normally how I would write at all. And they kind of look like stories rather than poems, you know, but it's just the way that they're determined to be written. And one of them is based on the poem. It's called Budgie. And a budgie is what you would call over here a parakeet. You know, it's we call them budgies back home. That's the only name I know for them back home. A budgie, a budgerigard. And in Rathcoole, where I grew up, the Protestant side of things. Now, I grew up Protestant, but at 18 and my father was 40, my father found out, it's a long, long story, that he was actually a Catholic from South Armagh, and his mum was actually a Catholic from County Tyrone, from Omagh. So, you know, I found out all these wonderful Catholic relatives, you know. So, you know, I like to think of myself as a cross-community poetic enterprise, you know. And so really in these poems, I'm trying to maybe explain the Protestant hood to the Catholic side of my family. But this poem, Budgie, is also based on the map of Ireland. Now, I know Paul, one of my favorite poems of all time is a short little poem by Paul Muldoon about, you know, seeing like his child in the kind of fetal position as like the map of Ireland, satellite map of Ireland. Spectacular. Oh, I've always loved that. So that's always been in the back of my mind. But I've always, my friend Alan, who's on here with me, I play the music with, it was him that got out of me how I think of the map of Ireland. And I think of the map of Ireland in a totally different way to anybody else that I know. Everybody sees Ireland, the island, back to the British mainland. And, you know, down through the years, poets have been writing about Ireland, basically, excuse my language, being shafted by the British mainland, you know, taken advantage of from behind, as it were, and all of that, and victimized. And I never saw it like that. From a kid up, when I looked at the map of Ireland, it looks to me like a budgie that is flying towards the British mainland. And so Lough Neagh becomes like the eye of the budgie, and the Ards Peninsula is like the beak, and Dublin is like the belly of the budgie, and you've got the wings of, you know, Sligo and whatever. And so I wrote a poem called Budgie for this 11th night sequence, and it's like a Protestant with Catholic blood and heritage at the center back home who's trying to say, here's the map of Ireland in a poem. And it's non-sectarian. This is an Ireland worth fighting for, if you know what I mean, for both sides. And it has an epigraph from William Drennan, who I did an MPhil thesis on, the great radical Presbyterian, who coined the phrase the Emerald Isle back in 1795 with a poem called Erin. And in that same poem, he wrote, drive the demon of bigotry home to his den. And where Britain made brutes, now let Erin make men. So here's my poem, Budgie. Thank you for listening, by the way. I can't wait. I love Attracta. I can't wait to hear Paul. Budgie. It seemed like every single house had one, except us, though we had an aquarium. The other house comfort of the working class, one behind the bars, the other behind glass. I thought it odd that the underprivileged would happily keep something tanked or caged, considering our hard human condition. I guessed it was our identification with creatures as poorly predestined as we often believed our hand-to-mouth selves to be. Keeping birds in seed is a real kind of love, and sprinkling fish flakes like manna from above. Now, by a strange quirk of imagination, some new light from within, something gene given. Every time I saw a map of Ireland, I rebelled against the usual notion, the bird's eye, map-driven visualization of Ireland back to the masculine mainland, her leafy petticoats eyed up for stripping, her feminine fields ripe for penile ploughing. Even as a child, I refused to see it as a victim, back turned towards Britain, inviting colonial rear-ending. I saw it as a battling budgie, facing the mainland, proudly, prepared for what might come winging over the waves from the gauntlet realm. Though couched by Drennan to properly provoke his fellow Irishmen to throw off the yoke, it was no base posterior of the world, arsehole waiting to be slavishly buggered by a foreign foe even our side flinched at. No more servile hungering for the lazy root, but male and broad-shouldered as the hill of caves, where the United Irishmen first swore slaves would be set free by jointly overturning the home-based kingdom of the sectarian. or bold-hearted budgie had come of age, had climbed the ladders and looked in the mirrors, then ignored the dungeon doors and bent the bars, self-paroled, assuming independent heirs. So turned towards the royal raven of England, to my mind, our Irish budgie was crowned with the head of Ulster, the brawn and brains of radical Belfast, the Athens of the North, with the clear blue eye of Ney and beak of Ards, heart, lungs, and Dublin barrel bulge of Leinster, the fairy feet and claws of mighty Munster, and thrown back western wings of mystic Connaught. 4 provinces, 4 square, forever landlocked, friend of brother Celts, but full of righteous rage against the keepers of the keys to the cage, the bard's blessed plot, his precious stones set in the silver sea, his dear, dear land, his England. Yes, no Catholic cage nor Protestant pound could hold my dissenting ideal of Ireland. For in spite of spite, it was Drennan's Eden, in the ring of this world, the most precious stone, his emerald of Europe, his emerald isle, which no vengefulness would finally defile. Thank you so much. These were great. Thank you.
The roar of 200 hands clapping. Thank you so much, Adrian. Adrian Rice. It's a wonderful book here. Thank you, Adrian.